The war in Ukraine has represented a kind of pressure test for many established military systems. Some, like rocket artilleries and drones, have thrived. Others, almost from the start, have faced sometimes hyperbolic questions about their future. Back in 2022, after a series of heavy Russian attack helicopter losses, I did a video basically arguing that it was way too early to call time on the helo, but the attack helicopters were facing mounting challenges to remaining relevant and cost-effective. 2 years later, friend of the channel, the Chieftain, also touched on the topic, giving more of a US Army view on why the attack helicopter remained relevant. And to help explain the doctrinal reasons there, he's generously allowed me to use a couple of clips from that episode today. But as the war in Ukraine has gone on, many of those threats we identified back in 2022 have continued to evolve. Drones, and now purpose-built interceptor drones, have matured as an anti-air threat. Ballistic missiles have proven their lethality against helicopter bases, and a couple of countries have started to hesitate when it comes to future attack helicopter investments. And so today, I'm going to look at the attack helicopters as they stand in 2025. Still dangerous and with a potential role in the modern battlefield, but challenged by new threats, alternatives, and their sky-high cost, which might leave some militaries wondering, even if they can get some potential use out of the things, whether those dollars, pounds, rubles, or euros might be better directed somewhere else. To do that, I'll briefly catch up on some of our previous coverage, and then discuss what it actually means for a system to be obsolete, and how the attack helicopter may be under pressure from a changing battlefield, and the crushing weight of cost-benefit analysis. To play out that discussion, we'll go over how attack helicopters are meant to be used in many Western forces, with a guest appearance by the Chieftain explaining the US Army view on the matter, and then switch over to looking at how they've actually been used in Ukraine by both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Then we'll zoom out to look at some of those big picture pressures. What kind of systems are both threatening the attack helicopter and threatening to take over the mission of the attack helicopter on the battlefield? How are different nations responding to the costs and economic pressures involved? And how the attack helicopters might continue to evolve to win perhaps their most challenging fight, the battle for budget dollars. Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. Now, in an ideal world, perhaps every major international event would get its own 1-hour PowerPoint. But given the pace at which those have been happening in 2025, sometimes even just passing the headlines can be challenging enough, especially when you account for the subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences between how different organisations choose to cover the news. If we flick through a couple of headlines on Russia's recent large-scale drone attack on Ukraine, for example, you'll see different sources can elevate different key information to the headline. This one, for example, highlights that Russia launched its largest drone and missile attack of the war. But ticking over to this one lets you put a number to that, nearly 750 drones and missiles. Whereas this one brings in one final piece of context. Noting the attack came soon after, President Trump pledged additional weapons for Ukraine. The tool being deployed here is Ground News. And not only does it allow you to quickly compare headlines, drawing on approximately 50,000 news sources around the world, it also helps you frame that with a variety of potentially useful context. From ownership information to factuality ratings, reportedly based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. And if you want to dig even deeper, there's a variety of other tools as well, including the ability to customize and focus your feed. But I also think it's worth just flagging this. Staying on top of a fast-moving, often very polarized information environment isn't easy. And while there's no silver bullet for challenges like echo chambers or flawed reporting, that doesn't mean there aren't tools out there that can help. And there's a reason that Ground News was this channel's first and longest running sponsor. And so if you're interested, consider checking out the link in the description that'll give you access to a 40% discount on their Vantage plan. And so with my thanks to Ground News, let's get back to it. Okay, so let's start then with what I might mean when I say the attack helicopter is under pressure, because I think there's often a danger of these kind of discussions devolving into a binary question. Is something obsolete or not? It is obviously possible with military equipment for the situation to be that cut and dry. Something new comes along that does the job of a previous system better in every single way, or its mission becomes obsolete, and as a result the previous system is no longer required. It would be very difficult, for example, to make an argument that matchlock muskets continue to have a battlefield role after the invention of the bolt-action and later semi-automatic and automatic firearms. Could you technically hurt someone with a musket on the battlefields of Donetsk and Luhansk? Possibly, but I imagine most infantrymen out there would probably prefer the ability to fire hundreds of rounds per minute, hundreds of meters into the distance, as opposed to the ability to loft 1 or 2 rounds per minute in the general direction of their opponent. But there's going to be a much larger range of systems out there, indeed just about anything, that could be technically useful under the right circumstances. Most NATO militaries would hopefully consider improvised mortars firing propane tanks, commonly referred to as hell cannons during the Syrian civil war, to be obsolete as artillery. But for rebels that otherwise didn't have much access to indirect fire assets or solutions to fortified positions, they clearly very often considered something to be better than nothing. You can also conceive of systems that would technically be useful, or indeed highly useful, but are ruled out not by their capability but by the costs involved. Would armies around the world love to assign every infantry company its own orbital bombardment satellite capable of dropping tungsten rods on enemy targets from orbit? Probably, but military spending levels that go north of 100% GDP tend to be hard to get past national legislatures. The point is that when it comes to military capability of just about any kind, there is, over a long enough timescale, a common currency: money. And as long as that resource remains limited, militaries can't have everything they want to have. So force design and the investment decisions that go into it is ultimately a game of hard choices. An example of the kind of question checklist here might be, what sort of mission does this thing fulfill? Can it do that mission effectively? Does that mission actually matter? Can other systems do the mission better? And based on the balance of those and the costs involved, is this an investment worth making? With the pressures on the attack helicopter specifically potentially mounting across each of those line items. Decent analogy here might be a points-buy system in a video game or tabletop wargame. A force has a limited number of points, read budget, to put together the most capable and fit-for-purpose military that it can. And while there is no end of spending combinations that a force could technically make work, or could potentially argue for given scenarios, some are arguably going to be much more optimal than others. If you're playing a wizard in Baldur's Gate, you could stack strength, but you'd probably do better with intelligence. If you were playing Warhammer as the Eldar several editions ago, you could build an army out of just about anything in the Codex, or you could stack warlocks on jet bikes and mechanized infantry and, win instead. And it's this kind of calculus, spoiler alert, where I'm arguing that for some forces, the attack helicopter might run into a couple of issues. But let's stick to the theoretical framework for the moment. Based on the presumption that you have limited resources, a variety of systems and capabilities you could invest in, then you can imagine fitting a lot of potential investments not into an obsolete, useful binary, but instead a kind of investment priority spectrum. This is just illustrative, but it might go something like this. At the top, you have a system or capability in an expansion phase. You recognize it offers a lot of value for money for the force you're trying to build, and so you're trying to add more of it to the force. That means accelerated procurement, bulking out more units, building up stockpiles, and allocating procurement dollars appropriately. For most forces out there at the moment that aren't leading the drone game, that would probably be drones. And for those that are, like Ukraine, Russia, and a couple of others, it would also be drones. One step down might be equipment in the maintain and modernize category. You may not want to make the investment necessary to build out new units or expand your overall inventory, but you do want to keep it up to date. If you're a country that isn't expanding its tank force, but does, for example, believe in adding active protection systems to provide greater protection against drones or ATGMs, that would arguably fit into this category. Another level down in terms of priority, with the cost savings that come along with that, would be just a straight maintain approach. You're not allocating the dollars to make it any better, you're not buying more of it, but what you're doing is dedicating the resources necessary to maintain the capability you have. Recently, for example, it was announced that the US Army was nixing its plan to introduce a new upgraded version of its armoured recovery vehicle, the M88 Hercules, diverting the funds from that M88A3 program to improving readiness and doing maintenance on the existing M88A2s. Step down again, and you might have categories of assets that you want to basically use up as a force. Something you might call the exploit or harvest category. This is where you might have stuff that is useful, that you can derive some value from, but isn't worth the investment to keep as part of the force long term. I doubt Russian High Command views the T-54-55 as an integral part of their planned future force for the 2030s and potential future conflicts with NATO, but they have the tanks available now, and it doesn't cost that much to wheel them to the front and essentially use them up. Even doing that, though, isn't free. It still requires personnel allocation, transportation assets, fuel, ammunition. And so militaries can get to the point where there is a type of equipment or element of the inventory that is so comparatively useless compared to the cost of continuing to operate it that it's worth getting rid of them essentially as soon as possible. This is the divest category. And this is where you might find a lot of truly obsolete technology. In order to understand where various countries might put the attack helicopter on that spectrum, we need to go back to that checklist from before. What's the mission? Can it do it? Does the mission matter? And can anything potentially do it more effectively or efficiently? And that has to start with the question of, what is the attack helicopter meant to do? And before I give a more Russia-centric answer to that question, based on what we've seen in Ukraine so far, I want to throw over to a section from the Chieftain's video, explaining how this is meant to work for the Apaches in US Army service.
The problem with framing the discussion is that people don't understand the primary function of the attack helicopter today. This is because, unlike the tank, the primary function of the helo has changed over time. What the attack helicopter was originally designed to do can indeed be pretty much achieved by other assets, maybe cheaper or better. But what the helicopter does today cannot be done by other assets. The question is whether or not you actually need those capabilities, and a lot of militaries don't. Now, I've been wanting to do this video for a while, but until recently I haven't had the time to check the publicly released manuals and training videos to make sure everything I'm going to say is open source, since we need to go into operational constructs. After spending the last 4 years in 2 Armoured Division headquarters, I've learned quite a lot about higher echelon operations, which I did not know before then. But they never tell you exactly what's public or not when you're learning it. But anyway, I've had the time now to look it up. So how has the function of the attack helicopter changed over time? When the AH-64 battalions entered service, they were in effect the modern take on the World War II Tank Destroyer Battalion. A divisional or regimental asset which was fragile but highly mobile, well armed and optimized for responding to enemy armoured assaults. A flight of 4 AH-64s crewed by 8 guys could respond to an enemy massed attack 50 miles away in under half an hour and could destroy an entire tank battalion with plenty of ammunition left over. I'm sure you've seen the sort of image of the Apaches and the tanks all working together to blow up an evil red commie tank battalion. Now, officially, the manual describes this sort of action as an attack in support of troops in close contact. More commonly, you hear it as an attack in contact or as an over-the-shoulder attack. It's how we've been using Apaches for most of the last 2 decades in the War on Terror. But in large-scale combat, it's also nearly suicidal. The front lines have simply gotten far too dangerous, and though such activities are indeed still in the manual, they are not the preferred usage for the attack helicopters. With the proliferation of anti-tank missiles down to the squad level and really damn good tanks, a NATO unit should be able to hold its own in battle without requiring subjecting an Apache or Tiger to the engagement envelopes of the masses of Pantsers, Tunguskas, Manpads, or anything else which potential adversaries tend to have in numbers at the front line. If you really do need to send a slow-flying aircraft with anti-tank missiles into that environment, save a life or 2 and use one with no humans aboard. NATO figured this out years ago. But if attack helicopters are no longer primarily used in close combat, what are they used for? So for the short version, I will let somebody with a little bit more rank than me have a word. This is Major General Eisenhower, formerly my CG at 1st Armored.
But it's important that you recognize at the division level, ABCTs are maneuver units. But the division's got responsibility for the division deep fight. And your maneuver unit, as a division commander, is the Apache battalions. All right, so no longer are we kind of in the business of the pink team overhead or in direct support over an infantry platoon or a tank platoon, but we're using those as maneuver elements to set conditions so that when the enemy comes in towards the close area or when the ABCTs reach the enemy, the COFRMs are right, where it's just not a fight.
Okay, so what does that mean? Well, how does it work to a layman? The first thing is he described the helicopters as a maneuver asset. Now, way back in the day, when I was a mere 1LT at the Maneuver Captain's Career Course, we generally spoke about aviation as a fires asset. And there were 2 reasons for this. Firstly, doctrine hadn't quite morphed to the extent we have today. So if you look at the aviation manual from 1997, for example, you will see that while they do describe aviation as a maneuver asset, there is something of a priority given towards performing fires roles. The other reason is that, well, as a captain or maybe a major, at the company and battalion level would never be using the attack helicopters as a maneuver asset instead of as a fire asset. For this mission, you will be supported by an attack helicopter company. And the reality is that all you're going to do is tell them what you need blown up to support you, just as you would with artillery. That doesn't apply at division level. There's probably a bit of a misunderstanding as to just what a division or higher does. So to quote my current CG, he is mildly interested in what his brigades are up to. He has perfectly competent full colonels running them. Once they're in the fight, the division commander's job is done as regards the brigades, and he's looking forward to the next fight, which is determined by what is defined as the division deep. Which now brings us to battlefield construct. A unit's area is defined as rear, close and deep. Subordinate maneuver units play in the close area. So for a core close area, it's the boxes that the Corps has given to the divisions to control. For a division close area, it's the play boxes that they have given to the brigades. For a brigade close, it's the area the battalions get to move in. Anything behind that is the rear area. So it's mainly logistics, admin, security taskings, but anything in front of the subordinate unit's play box is the deep. So the division deep is further behind the front line than the brigades are allowed to play in. And the brigade areas will normally cross over the front line as it is. So a division looks to see what battles the brigade might be involved in from 24 to 72 hours out, and sets the conditions so that when the brigades do make contact, it's not a fair fight. Now, those conditions could be related to anything considered important, be it logistics nodes, command nodes, destroying artillery, engineering abilities, or even just killing line battalions. But we're talking operations scores of kilometers behind the front line. There are various assets available to a division commander to do this, but most of them are considered fires. Long-range rockets, missiles, airstrikes from the Air Force, electronic attack, information warfare. Maneuver has its own definition, quote, employment of forces in the operational area through movement in combination with fires and information to achieve a position of advantage in respect to the enemy. Brigades, well, they're maneuver units, that's what they do. But they're used in the division close. Even the division cavalry squadron, if one is available, and it is a division commander's maneuver unit, obviously is only going to be able to get so far, if at all, beyond the front line. Thus, the only unit which can move and fight in the deep area is going to be the helicopter. Remember, we're not talking about some place within 1 or 2 dozen kilometers of the front line and thus within reliable radio range of a base station for a UAS. We are talking some serious distance here, and that's at the division level. You can imagine the distances that the Corps commander is looking to affect.
Okay, so we'll come back to some of the other elements of that assessment in a moment, but there's a reason I wanted to include it up front. Because I think if nothing else, it highlights how different doctrine can be between various forces and how careful we have to be about taking lessons from any particular war or conflict. Because if you look at a lot of the video evidence we have of Russian attack helicopter usage in Ukraine, it's very different from that theoretical description the Chieftain just gave, with a lot of it, frankly, more closely resembling those kind of roles the Chieftain said have been kind of sidelined in US service for large-scale combat operation contexts. In rough terms, I'd argue a lot of the Russian attack rotary usage we've seen fits into a couple of main categories. There's a fires role where the helicopters are essentially being used as an augment to the artillery, perhaps in the same way a BM-21 Grad might be, lofting unguided rockets against area targets. We've seen them used as a quick response force against enemy armoured attacks, particularly in 2023, and we'll go into that example a bit in a moment. And then in another version of the fires role, we've seen them used essentially as a precision strike asset, launching long-range ATGMs, often at night, against fixed or vehicle targets, augmenting things like glide bombs, lancets, tactical ballistic missiles, long-range drones, etc., but still primarily against targets relatively close to that forward edge of the battle area. A recent example of that kind of role might be what you see on the screen here, which is some relatively recent footage, claimed to be of Russian Kamov-50 attack helicopters, using their missiles to attack buildings allegedly hosting Ukrainian drone teams relatively close to the front line. So pocket artillery, standoff weapon platform, and quick response force against enemy armour. What you hear in that list is a lot of the American mission set from the 1990s, and not so much those raiding operations dozens or 100 kilometres behind the lines. That's not to say that we haven't seen any of that this war. We did, right at the start back in February 2022. Back then, remember, Russia launched long-range heliborne assaults using both attack and transport helicopters right up to the gates of Kyiv, attacking Hostomel Airport. The problem, however, which I think is relatively illustrative of the risks involved, is that they lost an absolute shit ton of helicopters doing so. After those opening weeks then, we saw both sides largely restrict their helicopters to their own sides of the line. We saw the rise of those rocket lofting attacks, long-range ATGM strikes, but nothing resembling those deep maneuver operations that Chieftain just talked about. That's not to say, though, that the Russian helicopter force didn't achieve anything after February 2022. And indeed, you could argue 2023 might have actually been the force's best year of the war. still not in that deep raiding maneuver role, but as that responsive tank hunting force that we talked about. When the Ukrainians launched their southern offensive in June 2023, the Russian attack helicopters were very clearly there. While there were some high-profile incidents, like ATGM attacks against John Deere farm machinery, those incidents arguably shouldn't take away from the fact that the helicopters were often able to engage armoured targets from well beyond their ability to respond, or in some cases even to detect, that they were able to operate at night and be highly lethal doing it. The report I have on the right there came out in February 2024 and looked at some of the Chinese literature that was released describing Russian attack helicopter performance in 2023, and it was generally quite positive about it. They suggested that instead of trying to penetrate through Ukrainian air defences, the Russians were now using their helicopters as an on-demand asset to destroy Ukrainian targets of opportunity and then rapidly exit the battlefield. They noted that Russian helicopters were routinely delivering strikes from 8 to 10 kilometres away from their target, a distance at which Ukrainian targets, quote, really cannot either see or hear the Russian attack helicopter, end quote. And during the peak of that Ukrainian armoured offensive in June 2023, Chinese analysts attributed a significant share of Ukrainian armoured losses to Russian attack rotary assets, suggesting that of approximately 125 Ukrainian armoured vehicles disabled in June 2023, more than 50 were victims of Russian attack helicopter operations. To cap it all off, they also claimed the survivability of Russian attack helicopters had likewise improved, drawing attention to a Russian claim of a situation where a single Kamov-52 was able to survive attack by no fewer than 18 Ukrainian missiles, due, the Russians claim, to the effective operation of its onboard electronic warfare system. Now, given the sourcing, I'd suggest that some of those numbers should be taken with a grain of salt, but the general assertion that the helicopters proved very dangerous, functioning as long-distance tank destroyers in June 2023, is hard to argue with. If it represented a renaissance of Russian attack helicopter operation, though, it was a comparatively short one, because soon after we saw a major inflection point that spiked Russian helicopter losses and forced them to downscale operations. This is, of course, when the Ukrainians finally started to receive ATACMS missiles from the United States, and almost immediately used them to blap a whole bunch of Russian helicopter bases with cluster munition rockets. As we've covered in the past, this appears to have been an absolute disaster for the Russian attack helicopter force, costing them valuable aircraft and forcing them to disperse and continue to maneuver the rest. Because with the arrival of ATACMS, any FARP, Forward Army and Refueling Point, within 100 plus kilometres of the line, was now potentially going to be a very attractive target, stacked with a bunch of expensive systems, not particularly suited to surviving a rain of high-explosive golf balls. What may have been different then if those missiles had arrived before, rather than during the Ukrainian offensive, is probably one of the major what-ifs of the overall operation. And I think it's worth noting that particular vulnerability of helicopters on the ground hasn't gone away in Ukraine in subsequent years. The most recent example of that I can think of is back in March, where the Ukrainians were able to use Gimlis rockets to hit a number of Russian helicopters on the ground. This is one of the challenges of being a valuable asset on a transparent battlefield where both sides have access to responsive long-range precision fires. You're valuable enough to be worth shooting the good munitions at. The big takeaway here is that, as best we can tell, the Russian attack helicopter fleet did continue to operate through 2024 and 2025, but the intensity of that usage and the results achieved were very different than they had been in 2023 or even 2022. Comparing that Chinese report to Russian claim data for Ukraine's Kursk offensive in 2024, for example, I think illustrates this well. If it was claimed that in June 2023, the attack helicopters accounted for about a third of included Ukrainian losses, in Kursk 2024, in the Russian data, they were basically an also-ran. After going through hundreds and hundreds of entries of claimed Ukrainian losses in Kursk, using the Russian-operated Lost Armor, visually confirmed loss database, I found no shortage of losses attributed to Lancet loitering munitions, airdrop glide bombs, artillery, guided missile systems, Iskander tactical ballistic missiles, a bunch of other stuff, and then precisely 2 engagements tagged as being helicopter-launched ATGMs. Although for whatever reason, the Russian database appears to have omitted some of the kills the Kamov-52 was credited with in the early stages of the Kursk offensive, perhaps because the incident in question involved the Russian helicopters misidentifying and then lighting up a Russian column. Again, that's not to say attack helicopter usage has ceased, just that the evidence of their usage has become much rarer. Visual evidence of confirmed losses is likewise much rarer than before, with, as you can see on the right there, the Oryx database including more than 50 Russian attack helicopters in 2022, more than 30 in 2023, and then fewer than 10 in 2024 and 2025. I'd also note that while Ukraine has received a huge amount of military equipment from NATO states, it hasn't received any NATO standard attack helicopters, nor made the decision to prioritise them. While sounds have occasionally been made about potentially acquiring a squadron or so worth of AH-1s, we haven't seen the Ukrainians and their allies actually move to make that happen. While you might argue that decision is based on the complexity of the platform and logistics, keep in mind we have seen the successful introduction of both F-16 and Mirage, more complicated and intensive fixed-wing aircraft, suggesting to me that the logistics challenges involved probably aren't insurmountable, but a decision has been made to focus available resources on higher return platforms first. Ukraine did receive a number of attack helicopters from the various allies, but they were primarily old Soviet types that were cheap and could be readily integrated into the force, primarily the Mi-24. Those also had some utility value because they can transport a small number of troops, and as you can see from this image here, some of those 24s appear to be claiming significant success as drone hunters, bringing down Shahed-style threats as part of Ukraine's wider air defence effort. So in summary, if you look at the evidence of the war in Ukraine, I'd argue that the attack helicopter has continued to show itself a useful, but expensive and sometimes secondary platform. It's been used essentially as an artillery system, a precision strike system using standoff munitions, and as a drone hunter. But evidence for deep behind-the-lines operations is comparatively extremely sparse. The point where we can potentially see some crossover between the evidence for Ukraine and arguments about the future of the attack helicopter in Western militaries, however, is on the question of why. Because I'd argue the evidence suggests it's not for a lack of creativity, a lack of desire, or even a lack of trying. This is why the topic of vulnerability for the attack helicopter is so critical to its future. Because it's absolutely fair to say that just because a system is vulnerable in the modern battlefield doesn't mean it doesn't have a place there. The infantryman was vulnerable on the battlefield even before we figured out how sharpened stones worked. And yet infantry has perhaps been the only constant of warfare from prehistory to modern times. Vulnerability by itself doesn't necessarily mean that a system isn't highly useful and worth investing in. Being so vulnerable that it can't effectively perform that core mission potentially does. So what I want to do now is unpick in a bit greater detail the threat profile facing the attack helicopter on the modern battlefield, and why it seems likely that going forward, the situation is likely to get a lot worse before, if ever, it gets better. Before we dive into it though, I want to throw briefly back to Chieftain for a discussion about how this is on paper meant to work. With the joint force blowing a hole in the enemy's air defence system, the helicopters rolling through it, and then proceeding to wreak havoc behind the lines.
Now, the advantage here is that however dense the air defences are at the front line, they are a lot less dense once you go a score or 2 kilometres into the rear. The trick is getting through that front line, which I guarantee is going to be a subject of division artillery, if nothing else, and then you still go on for a few kilometres. Something which you will note that the Ukrainians have managed to do with their drones, or cruise missiles if you prefer, which are made from converted general aviation aircraft. Think something that looks like a Cessna with a radio controller. One might think that a capable Air Force and air defence system might have something to say about that sort of thing in conventional combat though. Well, it can be done. It takes good planning, and it also takes something which some militaries have, which, say, the Russians and Ukrainians don't, and that's an Air Force with NATO-level capabilities. So, doubtless you are familiar with Red Flag. Big war games that the Air Force runs in Nevada with a competent enemy Air Force and air defense network. The sort of challenge which might affect a couple of Apache battalions trying to work their way a few kilometers into the enemy rear area, right?
But no kidding, we integrated literally beneath the Red Flag exercise. So we had 5th gen aircraft, I think dozens, doing what the Air Force is really good at, setting conditions electronically, conducting what amounted to JSEED to support our deep attack infiltration into what became a raid for 2 Apache battalions. 566 kilometers round trip.
No, you didn't mishear that distance. Now, even if you assume that the Apaches were based a couple of dozen kilometers behind the front line in safe, well, relatively safe terrain, that is a serious depth of penetration. Now, remember what I said about the firepower. 4 Apaches can wipe out a battalion. The attack that the general was describing was 24 Apaches. So these are capable of flying at or below treetop level, depending on the gaps in the trees. Capable of identifying and prioritizing their own targets, all done without any emissions, which could be jammed, signal lost, or which could be used to locate the transmitting aircraft. and also there's no lag involved. And when you get there, a target that far behind the front line isn't going to be swarming with low altitude air defense systems. Whatever would be on the receiving end of this raid would have been absolutely schwacked. The next day, maybe those same gunships can be used to provide fire support to an air assault. If it's safe enough for the transport helicopters, it's safe enough for the gunships. And at this time, there is nothing else in an inventory which can reliably do.
The challenge I'd note, of course, is that sometimes even the attack helicopters themselves can't do that. Otherwise, Russia's early heliborne operations might have turned out very differently than they ultimately did. But as the argument probably goes, maybe that wasn't the best planned and executed operation in human history. And I'm generally very grateful for the explanation. When it comes to the question of the vulnerability of the attack helicopter, though, there are a couple of lines and potential assumptions there that make me a tad nervous. With the big one being just how survivable attack helicopters will be in 10 to 15 years, either in the rear areas where they need to rearm and refuel, or those deep zones the Chieftain talked about well behind the enemy front line. And that concern draws me in a little bit to statements like this one.
Now, even if you assume that the Apaches were based a couple of dozen kilometers behind the front line in safe, relatively safe terrain, that is a serious depth of penetration.
Sure, a position 24 kilometers behind the front line might be safer than parking in a frontline trench, but I think the question of just how much safer it would be on a conventional battlefield against a peer opponent is a bit of an open question. At a few dozen kilometers, you're still talking about territory in range of relatively cheap opposing reconnaissance drones. You're still going to be in range of things like MRLs, extreme range cannon ammunition, and absolutely TPMs, which is potentially problematic given how much better we've seen the Russians get at identifying targets and then hitting them in a reactive manner using their Iskander missiles. The Ukrainians have proven you can make that threat survivable, even for high-value platforms like aircraft, but it takes a lot of effort, shuffling and dispersion that imposes an operational tax on personnel and equipment and reduces how effective they can be compared to a universe in which they weren't constantly under threat. From a survivability perspective, you could argue that helicopter FARPs are almost always going to be in a bit of an awkward position compared to some other potential target types. Out of necessity, they're often going to be temporary locations further forward, which means you're unlikely to be able to harden them like you might a permanent airbase for fast jets, and they're also unlikely to benefit from the same type of multi-layered air defense system. A permanent airbase might get THAAD or Patriot protection, a temporary alligator or Apache nest, perhaps not. At the same time, it's hard for FARPs to benefit from the kind of survivability methods that other assets in Ukraine often use. You can't really armour helicopters against missile or drone strikes, and the idea of dispersing your assets so you're not worth wasting a valuable munition on doesn't work when you're something as valuable as a helicopter, where even one might merit taking the shot. And we have seen confirmed cases of the Russians being perfectly willing to fire off an Iskander or two against one or two utility or transport helicopters refueling, to say nothing of how they might respond to the prospect of taking a shot at a fully loaded Apache. So issue one might be that in order to get the best out of attack helicopters when they're operating in that maneuver behind the lines role, you might have an incentive to refuel and support them as close to the line as possible, but that might be very dangerous to do in a world where your opponent has access to better sensors, better networking, and ever more responsive and dangerous long-range precision fire options. But of course, assets do survive close to the front line all the time, otherwise there wouldn't be a front line left in Ukraine. The next issue then presumably becomes punching them through that line, so they can then go about that mission of manoeuvring and wreaking havoc in the deep. As Chieftain points out, history suggests that suppressing or destroying enemy air defense systems is a complicated task that probably requires a lot of planning and effort, but we have seen cases of it being done, with perhaps the most recent example being the Israeli Air Force gaining air superiority over Iran, to the point where they could operate fourth-generation platforms in enemy airspace using relatively short-range munitions like JDAM. But the question of what it would realistically take to punch a large formation of attack helicopters through the air defense system of a country like Russia or the People's Republic of China is, I think, a bit more challenging as a prospect than getting to the point where you could fly F-15 over Tehran. As a general rule, I'd be very nervous about dismissing the effectiveness of the Russian air defense system. Over the course of the war, they've succeeded in shooting down an awful lot of targets, from fixed-wing aircraft and slow-moving drones to complex targets like tactical ballistic missiles or stealthy cruise missiles like Storm Shadow. As the Chieftain points out, the Ukrainians are relatively routinely able to get drones through that defense system to hit things like industrial targets behind the lines, but part of that, just like Shaheds getting through the Ukrainian system, is just a game of quantities. In a lot of cases, most of the drones don't get through. A lot of the reconnaissance drones don't survive for more than a couple of sorties, and the attrition rate for unmanned systems in general is astronomical. It's just that those systems are affordable enough and accessible enough that both sides can afford to throw enough mud at the proverbial air defense wall, knowing at least some of it is going to stick. Just one of Ukraine's major drone units, Magyar's Birds, claims to have brought down about 400 Russian fixed-wing drones just in July, which might give you an idea of just how much attrition those UAS have to accept in order to continue completing their missions at least some of the time. If instead of using $30,000 drones, you're now using $50 million helicopters with 2 human crew aboard, an expected loss rate of yes, punching through the system, might not be considered acceptable. And it also implies here that from an investment perspective, you're talking about putting money into what is essentially a win harder system. The attack helicopter in this construction only gives you the best possible payoff if you have all the other systems necessary to punch the hole in the air defense system for them first. If there is any doubt that you have the assets necessary to achieve that effect, whether that be the communications, the aircraft, the munitions, the training, etc., you may have a reason to put the dollars there first to make sure you win that stage of the fight and get the conditions set, rather than maximising the assets you have available to exploit that scenario once you get there. In general, successfully suppressing enemy air defences might be a big ask, especially if you're not talking about the likes of Iraq or Iran, but rather, depending on which power is doing the evaluation, the likes of NATO, the Russian Federation, or People's Republic of China. The level of suppression or destruction involved would also, you imagine, be more intense than if you were talking about getting fixed-wing aircraft through. Unless they're playing in the proverbial mud, fixed-wing aircraft tend to be relatively hard and complex targets. Being at a much higher altitude than the helicopters gives them an energy advantage, as does their much higher speeds, meaning under most circumstances, the only air defense systems that are going to threaten them are the more complex and capable ones. S-400 or Patriot might be a threat to a relatively high-flying aircraft, while something like a Stinger couldn't even make it up to the required altitude. For the attack helicopters though, all of those shorter-range, lower-echelon threats are, well, threats. And so while the jets may only require the big stuff to be taken offline, temporarily or permanently, for the choppers, you'd probably want to suppress all that short-range stuff as well, which I imagine is possible, but all the harder. Your satellite reconnaissance might help you locate all the relevant S-400 batteries in the area of operation, but it probably won't tell you if Private Conscriptovich has an Igla stashed in the back of his Kamaz or not. And in many respects, I'd argue we've seen these lower echelon threats that the helicopters might have to worry about become both more common and more deadly in recent years. More recent ATGM designs have gained performance, range, guidance, and jam resistance improvements, making them hard to defend against, and in some cases also have lock-on after launch or indirect fire capabilities, meaning that even, for example, if you're aware an attack helicopter might be hiding behind a terrain feature and thus can't get a direct lock on it, you can instead lob the missile over the feature and lock on afterwards. Short and medium-range air defense systems have become a renewed area of focus for many forces, with new designs coming out, with a special focus on the ability to engage low-flying targets. The system you see on the right there, for example, is the US Army's relatively new Sergeant Stout, which includes not just a gun and small-scale missile system for engaging drones, but also anti-air Hellfire missiles, considerably expanding its reach and narrowing the gap between what the helicopters have and what the short-range air defenders have. And then there's a big one, FPVs and loitering munitions. FPVs have just become a fact of life on the Ukrainian battlefield, as have loitering munitions, and there's every reason to expect they'll make their way in greater numbers into forces around the world over time. And even just over the last couple of years, we've seen significant improvements in range, guidance reliability, automation with things like AI integration for terminal guidance, improvements to the warhead and other lethality improvements, and perhaps most significantly, massive increases in production volumes. Meaning that unlike something like manpads or ATGMs that can out of necessity only be scattered around a force, FPVs and loitering munitions can potentially be made available almost universally. As far back as 2023, for example, drone operators were often a company-level asset, while now you also see dedicated higher echelon drone formations that could potentially pose a threat to any particularly adventurous helicopters. As yet, we haven't seen a huge number of successful engagements by FPVs or loitering munitions against rotary-wing targets. There have been some confirmed kills against transport helicopters and a number of claimed attacks against attack helicopters. And it's worth saying that compared to a lot of other targets out there, like tanks for example, attack helos remain relatively fast, agile, and in some ways difficult to hit. But given how valuable they are and how numerous the FPVs and loitering munitions are, it's hard to ignore the threat they currently pose, let alone the threat they might pose in the future. But the biggest threat, I'd argue, might not actually be the attack drones themselves, but rather the countermeasure, the interceptor drone, because out of necessity, these things are generally going to have to be both high performance and intended to be highly lethal against agile aerial targets, which, unfortunately for the helos, I'd argue very much includes them. Another major point of concern might be that what we've just discussed is really just the threat profile as we're seeing it now, but there's reason to believe at least some of those threats are likely to get worse, which matters because when countries sink big money into their attack helicopter fleets, they're generally intending to make a long-term investment. You'll find some US sources talking about Apaches serving into the 2060s, and I doubt Poland's buying nearly 100 of the things on the expectations that they'll be using them for civilian joyrides by the mid-2040s. But those threat categories I talked about aren't going to be static over that timeline. The ability of major militaries to responsibly strike targets at range with precision has generally been on the up. 20 years ago, PHL-03 was only just entering service. In Russia, Iskander didn't exist, and with a CEP of yes, the Tochka-U that preceded it didn't exactly provide the same threat. Across the board, many militaries have improved their ability to form kill chains against targets behind the lines, which might have implications for the helicopters or just about anything else, that previously relied on the at least relative advantage of those kind of rear areas. Once they do get into the battle space, UAS and loitering munitions are likely to continue to improve rapidly, gaining performance, features like autonomous guidance that makes them harder to counter with electronic warfare, and become more common with more advanced launches. There are already UAS designed to autonomously hunt in designated areas for specific target types, often air defense systems. And if you're looking for other things that might be distinctive enough for an autonomous system to be able to positively identify, attack helicopters might make the list. We're seeing experiments with giving those drones more effective weapon systems, including missiles carried on drones. The Russians, Brits, and many others have tested that. And we're also seeing larger and more complex UCAVs and large UAS with the capabilities to match. And then there are the soft capabilities, like autonomous swarming, where a bunch of drones might be able to effectively work together in order to identify and engage targets, sweeping through a zone essentially like a proverbial plague of explosive locusts. Some of that evolution may not even relate just to the UAS themselves, but rather the networks and technology that support them. Chieftain spoke about the challenge of maintaining a stable signal out to an unmanned system operating dozens of kilometers behind the lines, but at this point, despite Russia and Ukraine being massive EW practitioners, we've seen drones controlled over vast distances. Basically, the drones are getting better, a lot faster than the attack helicopters, and to be fair, just about everything else is getting better. And because most forces have a pretty strong incentive for their campaigns to not just devolve into a game of who gets spotted and killed by the other guy's drones first, there's a renewed focus in many forces on both improving their short-range air defense options and adding more of the systems that they already have or are developing. Different sensors and missile systems are increasingly better networked together, meaning that in the future, just flying low might not provide the same degree of protection it currently does, because if any sensor in the opposing force sees you, that might be enough to cue an air defense system onto you. But for me, one of the biggest areas to watch might be the anti-drone drones. They provide an option to resolve or limit that shot exchange problem and give a comparatively simple, affordable, and potentially reusable or recoverable hard kill option even for lower echelon units. For armies that dream of being able to maneuver or set up headquarters without being constantly swarmed by drones, that might be a great thing. But for the gunships, I'd argue it might run the risk of them becoming essentially technological collateral damage. In order to be effective against the kind of threats we foresee, interceptor drones have to be extremely widely available. Zelensky has publicly talked about a production goal of about 1,000 interceptors per day. And if you look at the Ukrainian example, you need to disperse them amongst the force and in the rear areas to limit the odds your opponent gets around that threat by just finding a soft area and channeling all their drones through that. In Ukraine, for example, interceptor drones might not be operated just at the front line, but also mobile air defense and drone hunting teams well behind it. And a lot of the concepts we're seeing Western developers come up with for future interceptors are containerized, highly mobile systems, running the gamut from things that troops could physically carry on their person, to basic launch systems that you could mount on the back of a Humvee, a truck, or even an unmanned ground vehicle. The scenario I'm essentially describing is one where you don't have a line of air defense systems trying to hold threats out, but rather a kind of air defense mesh, where all or most of your units, whether they be maneuver battalions or rear area formations, stack up at least some level of air and missile defense capability, to the point where it's essentially deeply embedded in the terrain you're operating in. To borrow from what the US Marines have said, you might be looking at a future where every Marine can be considered a drone defender, and then to go beyond that, every formation has its own drone defenses. Not in the form of the big stuff that will likely remain concentrated in dedicated units, but maybe a couple of FPV interceptors or a roadrunner in a box. And if you're trying to plan gunship operations, that kind of universe might make you nervous. Remember, Chieftain described a universe where air defense systems are dense at the front line, but once you get well beyond that, the threat starts to fall off. My concern would be what happens if that threat does drop off, yes, but not necessarily to the point where the helicopters could expect to operate without taking very painful casualties. A high-performance interceptor like the Roadrunner might have a performance well outpacing the attack helicopter, have a range measured in the dozens or hundreds of kilometers, be launchable from just about anywhere, have a warhead capable of bringing down helos just as surely as it can something like a Shahed, and priced in such a way that the defender might be able to have 100 or hundreds of the things dispersed across their force for the cost of every attack helicopter opposing them. Meanwhile, for the smaller, cheaper Ukrainian-style systems, you might be looking at a cost differential of thousands to one. Essentially, there are two core risks here. One, that while the military might not be able to take the Oprah approach to handing out complex air defense systems, interceptor drones are cheap enough that you might be able to hand them out like Happy Meal toys. And the second is that because of the nature of the emerging drone threat, they might have every reason to do so. The drone paradox, then, might go something like this. In order to protect as much as possible of their role, the attack helicopters need to exist in a universe where the drones aren't playing a completely outsized role. But one of the defining features of a lot of potential universes where that isn't the case is the wide-scale ability of interceptors and anti-drone defenses. And those same defenses might make it very difficult for the helos to do their job behind enemy lines. Obviously, at this point, a lot of that threat profile is still hypothetical. But based on what we've seen in Ukraine and the trends with technology that we've seen, it does seem that a lot of forces out there are getting a bit nervy about future survivability. To be fair, not all the investment traffic has been one way here. Poland, for example, is in the process of building up an inventory of about 100 AH-64 Apaches, while India, which obviously has to operate in an environment with some difficult terrain, long distances, and fighting against both conventional and unconventional opponents, has also purchased additional Apaches. While both nations have their own internal debates about the survivability and suitability of the attack helo, both have concluded that for their specific strategic situations, for the moment the investment is worth it. Both of those acquisitions, though, I'd argue highlight a potential risk to the attack helicopter beyond just vulnerability to systems like interceptor drones or SHORAD, the incredible costs involved. Poland is spending roughly $10 billion to acquire 96 helicopters and the supporting weapons, training, and sustainment for them. Meaning all up, if you want the choppers and everything you need to effectively operate them, you're looking at something like $100 million per unit. For India, likewise, the recent acquisitions haven't just been for helicopters, but also for support systems, weapons, training, etc. But again, the patch purchase price is more than $100 million per unit. Meaning from an investment perspective, you probably want to be really, really sure that you need the capabilities the attack helo provides before you put that sort of money on the table. Nor would you want to risk falling into the trap that arguably the Russians have, where even though they found a way to get some use out of their attack helicopters, there are plenty of voices that would argue that they might have been better off if a bunch of those attack helicopters had instead been fighter bombers equipped with glide bombs, drones, or anti-drone electronic warfare systems, to name just a few alternative investments. Then there are countries that arguably fit more into that upgrade category we discussed earlier. The Netherlands, for example, has an existing Apache fleet, which they're in the process of upgunning and upgrading by spending about $250 million to equip them with joint air-to-ground missiles. That's a much smaller investment than buying additional helicopters, but still a significant chunk of change to drop on giving them increased weapon range and lethality. At the other end of the spectrum, though, there are the countries that are dialing back. Back in 2023, Japan announced that it would be ditching its attack helicopter fleet to move towards drones instead. Well, more recently, it's been announced that the Republic of Korea will be cancelling its planned Apache acquisition, again so funds can be redirected towards other higher priority areas. Germany, in a sense, is embracing a kind of halfway solution where they retire their existing attack helicopter fleet of Tigers a number of years earlier than planned, while purchasing more than 60 cheaper light attack helicopters, some of which will be equipped with Spike long-range anti-tank guided missiles, in what some coverage has described as a kind of bridging solution until a new generation of systems, including drones and loitering munitions, are ready for fielding. Perhaps the most interesting recent announcement, though, has come from the world's foremost operator of attack helicopters, the US Army. Earlier this year, they announced a series of significant restructures, with major investments to be made in certain systems, but major cuts taking place to others. The M10 Booker mobile protected fire system was one casualty of that process, while part of the US Army attack helicopter fleet became another. At the moment, the US Army operates two main Apache models, the newer Echoes and the older Deltas. The budget procurement targets are for very roughly 800 Echoes, while there are about 100 Deltas still in inventory. The new announcement is that those Deltas are now going to be retired without additional procurement or replacement, while some time ago the Army's Future Attack and Reconnaissance Helicopter program, FARA, was also cancelled. That basically leads to a scenario where the US Army is going to be slimming down its attack helicopter inventory and focusing on just a single model, ditching the Deltas and focusing just on the newer Echoes. Some of the language we heard from senior US officials about those cuts as part of the Army Transformation Initiative, I think give us a couple of clues about how the Army sees the attack helicopter, its future place, and the kind of factors that might tilt the investment decision, even of a force that very much still believes in the attack helicopter one way or the other. The quote from one article, as part of the move, the Army said it would phase out obsolete and outdated aviation platforms, specifically citing the AH-64D. The reductions will also see the Army cut 11 air cavalry reconnaissance squadrons, which currently operate the Apache in conjunction with the RQ-7B Shadow. To quote another official, what we wanted to absolutely do was preserve combat power. That's why we went after things that we felt we didn't need for the next fight. End quote. So why then, applying that logic, might you choose to get rid of Apaches while also keeping a bunch of Apaches? With the most obvious answer being that while these are still the same family of attack helicopters, there are differences in both capability and cost. The Echoes have a range of upgrades and additional blingy features over the older model, and in part because they're just newer, their maintenance costs are also much lower. For fiscal year 2025, the reimbursement rate for an AH-64 Delta was about $11,000 per flying hour. That was about the same cost per hour as the Air Force's A-10s, and not that much cheaper than things like the F-16 at $14,000 per hour, or even the F-15EX at $16,000. For the AH-64E though, the cost was under $6,000 per hour, giving it a major advantage on the cost side of that cost-benefit calculation. That to me is more consistent with a system that's considered a bit of a line ball in terms of investment decisions, rather than one that's clearly obsolete or alternatively a world beater. If the attack helicopter was viewed as useless, you wouldn't keep even the newer versions, while if it was at the top of the investment spectrum we discussed earlier, you'd probably try and hold on to every example you have, regardless of the model or the cost. See the way the US Congress tries to hold on to every F-22 Raptor airframe it can, even the older ones that the Air Force continually tries to discard, or the Russians and Ukrainians retaining every artillery piece they have that postdates the Battle for Berlin, and a couple that don't. The potential problem, though, for attack helicopters in future budgetary battles is that a newer, cheaper to maintain system doesn't remain cheaper and newer forever. Eventually, almost inevitably, those per hour costs are going to start to climb again, and the decision will have to be made again, whether it be in 5 or 15 years, to either recapitalise the fleet to add more capability and bring down costs again, or to look again at the role and size of the fleet. As we get closer to the end of the video then, there are probably two other factors to discuss when it comes to the potential future of the attack helicopter, with the first being the final threat to its role, not in the form of cost or battlefield vulnerability, but rather the encroachment of other systems or groups of systems, at least from the perspective of some forces, onto the attack helicopter's battlefield niche. Before finally, we look at some of the ways the platform might be able to evolve to stave off some of those potential challenges. If you go back to that checklist we set out at the start, we've now talked about whether the attack helicopter can still do its job, and whether it might be seen as cost-effective in doing so. But from an investment perspective, these last two also matter. Do you actually need something to do the job, and can something else potentially do the job better or more efficiently? As the Chieftain noted, the US view is that some parts of the former role of the attack helicopter have already very clearly been taken over by other systems. The question is, can anything take over the doctrinal role it now occupies? And while the answer in the short term is probably no, from an investment perspective, however, I think that statement comes with at least two asterisks. The first is that just because doctrine calls for something, that doesn't mean it's actually correct to do so, and there is sometimes a danger of doctrine becoming self-fulfilling. Doctrine and the requirements that flow out of it have to constantly be tested and challenged, because ultimately it can be much quicker and cheaper to change your doctrine than to update your entire equipment park, or even more expensively, try to go to war with the wrong stuff. A lot of militaries have decided they don't need or can't afford the capabilities the attack helicopter provides, and have come up with ideas on how to fight without it. The other asterisk is that in some cases, even though it might not be possible to replace the capability that a particular platform like the attack helicopter provides on a one-to-one basis with something else in a perfect fashion, it might be possible in some cases to get most of the way there by compositing different other systems together. A recent high-profile example might be the debate around the future E-7 AWACS aircraft in the United States, where the plan originally put forward in the 2026 budget, that now looks like it's going to be revised by Congress, called for cancelling the next-generation E-7 AWACS aircraft and instead replacing it with two different systems: space-based air-moving target indicator satellites and the Navy's older E-2D Hawkeye AWACS. The Hawkeye is in many respects far from the Wedgetail's equal. It's smaller, slower, shorter ranged, and it doesn't have the same sensor package. But it would be considerably cheaper, freeing up resources for those space-based assets. And so the debate now isn't whether the E2 can replace the E7, but whether the E2 and the satellites can replace the E7. As an Australian, I'm obviously going to say nice things about the Wedgetail, but hopefully you get the concept. So a complicating question for the attack helicopter then might be, can forces take the capabilities it provides, deconstruct them, and spread them over different platforms, and end up with potentially a more effective or efficient result? Could you, for example, move some of those weapons or sensors onto drones or other platforms? Could you rely more on ground-fired missiles or weapons deployed from collaborative combat aircraft UCAVs? The number of permutations are basically infinite, and we don't have time to go through all of them here. The point is, even if the attack helicopter is the only system out there capable of doing its particular assigned mission, it's probably not the only component you need to win a future fight. And in the end, it's all likely to come back to priority. Do you want that maneuver capability that the attack helicopter is meant to give you? Or do you want more drones and loitering munitions, long-range fires, space-based assets, updated communications, better cyber warfare capabilities, better EW capabilities? Updates to your air and missile defense system, short-range air defenses so you don't get blapped by the other side's drones. My concern would be that for a lot of militaries looking forward, the attack helicopter won't be seen as useless, far from it. But after decades of peace dividend level spending and rapid technological evolution, there might be a long list of stuff on the to-buy list that's more useful. And so while things like interceptor drones and improved air defenses might threaten the attack helicopter, if anyone or anything is truly going to kill or threaten it, it's going to be the budgetary bean counters. To fight for those budgetary dollars then, you'd expect the attack helicopter will have to continue to evolve, bringing more and more to the table to protect its role and justify the associated price tag. We've gone over some of these in the past, but it's worth reflecting on some of the broad areas of development. For example, there are efforts to increase the lethality of the helicopter by increasing the range of the munitions it carries. The United States and some of its allies are rolling out new versions of the Hellfire missile and the Joint Air-to-Ground missile that offer considerably more reach than the systems that came before. A version of the Jagan was tested, showing a hit against the target 16 kilometers away when launched from the ground, so with no energy assistance from the launching platform. The Israeli Spike Enlos, or non-line-of-sight missile, is rated for targets at 20 miles. And we've seen images of American Apaches carrying those Spike missiles. What that additional range potentially allows you to do is turn the helicopter into more of a standoff platform. So even as more of those short-range air defense systems are added to the battlefield, the helicopter is able to outrange and potentially kill them. That might not provide an answer to air defense systems pilots don't know are there, like concealed man-pads positions or interceptor drones, but it might go some way towards reducing the risk, and we saw the Russians achieve some effectiveness with their long-range ATGMs back in 2023 and beyond. We've talked in the past about one of their primary ATGMs, NATO designation AT-16, that offers ranges in the same rough category as that American Jaguar. And then there's the LMUR, an absolute chonker of missile coming in at more than 100 kilos, that offers ranges out to 15 kilometers, with the additional freedom of it not being a beam rider, meaning the helicopter doesn't have to keep the pipper on the target until the missile impacts. Missiles with non-line-of-sight capabilities, like Spike Enlos, might have particular survivability benefits, because they enable a helicopter to leverage one of its main advantages, that it can hide behind terrain features while still engaging its targets. A helicopter might be able to poke up with its sensor, identify a target, drop down, and then engage from behind a terrain feature, which obviously makes detection and engagement with direct fire weapons much more difficult. Now, of course, those missiles aren't purely limited to choppers. You could ground launch them, attach them to drones, etc., but they might bring a particular utility to attack or utility helicopter platforms. Another option for the attack helicopter, rather than surrendering to the drones, is to become more like them and enlist them. Optional manning, where a helicopter can fly with or without a crew, might give commanders the ability to deploy their attack helicopters in otherwise unacceptably risky situations when the mission requires it, without, critically, risking the lives of the crew in the process. Although if you intend to take the crew out of the equation most of the time, you imagine you might be better off with a clean sheet design that doesn't have to make all of the engineering concessions necessary to accommodate the squishy humans inside. There's also the possibility of better protecting helicopters with next-generation countermeasures. We've seen American Apaches, for example, flying with the Common Infrared Countermeasure Self-Protection System, CRCM, or to benefit from manned-unmanned teaming, where you might have an attack helicopter essentially become a command node for a team of drones, giving you a forward sensor and control platform that can be used by the crew to control formations of drones well behind enemy lines. Again, that's not something that only the attack helicopter can do. Forces looking at manned-unmanned teaming for everything from ground vehicles to aircraft to naval applications, but it might be seen as a possibility to provide additional mass, survivability, and lethality to existing attack helicopter formations. Because instead of your hypothetical Apache raid of 24 helicopters, you might instead be able to get away with 4 or 8, plus all of their accompanying drones. Whether or not that shifts the cost-benefit enough to move the needle on future investment decisions is at the moment something that only time will tell. The technologies are still evolving, and it will probably also take some time for doctrine and tactics to catch up. But the core point is that just as with other systems like the tank, it's important to understand that just because new technologies might emerge that threaten an existing system, that doesn't mean the incumbent technology won't be able to evolve in response. And you can bet designers will be moving quickly to try and keep their systems as competitive and attractive as possible. In conclusion then, I think the current trend, looking at the war in Ukraine and investment decisions around the world, is the attack helicopter, despite some of the continuing hype, isn't dead. What it is though, is under pressure. Under pressure from emerging threats, tight budgets, and challenges to the assumption about what the battlefield of the future is likely to look like. Perhaps the most important thing for militaries going forward then will to make sure that when they're looking at this platform and the investment they're thinking about putting into it, that they're honest, thorough, and imaginative when it comes to their assumptions about future battlefields. And that when it comes to specialized systems like the attack helicopter that requires the rest of the force to set conditions for it to deliver the best possible value, they make sure to make the other investments necessary to get to that point, be that in drones, fires, air assets, etc., lest they find themselves, as the Russians have, with an expensive, on paper, very dangerous force that ends up falling far short of delivering on its hypothetical military potential. And okay, channel update to close out. Firstly, thanks very much to the Chieftain for allowing parts of his video to be used in today's episode. I'm very aware that when I come at problems like evaluating a system or potential piece of military technology, I'm going to tend to look at it through a very specific defense economic-centric lens. And so I think it can sometimes be helpful to get a different perspective on a question, informed by different expertise and a different base of experience. So hopefully you appreciated his views on the matter, and I'd encourage you to check out the full version of his episode if you're interested. This thankfully marks the second week in a row where our planned topic hasn't been derailed by some dramatic international event, and I don't know about you, but I'm very much hoping that trend continues for another 1 or 2 at least. On the off chance our luck holds, patrons, there should be a topic priority poll going up for you most likely tomorrow at time this releases, and if the result there is particularly close, I might throw to the broader YouTube community as a tiebreaker. Other than that, just let me say thank you for your ongoing support and engagement as always, and I do hope to see you all again next week.